A painful decision. The shadows of doubt. The early morning air was thick with silence, broken only by the quiet hum of a distant car engine. Nia sat motionless on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around Malachi as he slept against her chest. His warmth seeped through the fabric of her worn-out hoodie, his tiny fingers twitching slightly in his slumber. She could hear Jared moving around the small apartment, his footsteps restless. The walls seemed to close in on her. The reality of their decision loomed like a storm cloud. She knew she should be strong, but the weight of it made her feel like she was drowning. "You're still thinking about it," Jared's voice cut through the quiet, hoarse with exhaustion. Nia didn't look up. "How can I not?" Jared exhaled loudly and leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We've been over this. It's the best thing we can do for him." She lifted her eyes to meet his, searching for some hesitation, some sign that he was struggling with this as much as she was. But his face was unreadable, his features tense. "I keep asking myself if I'm a terrible mother for even considering this," she murmured, her fingers tracing small circles on Malachi's tiny back. Jared's jaw tightened. "You're not a terrible mother, Nia. You're doing what's right. Is it?" Her voice cracked. "Or is it just easier?" The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. A world that wouldn't love him. Nia had spent her childhood in a world where skin color dictated worth. She had seen how her own mother, who was lighter than her, had been treated differently. She had watched her father struggle to be respected in his own workplace, despite his intelligence and work ethic. But Malachi, he was different. Even at the hospital, she had seen the subtle shift in expressions when the nurses looked at him. When Jared's mother visited, her reaction had been swift and sharp. The pursed lips, the barely hidden disappointment. "Oh," she had said. That single syllable had said everything. Jared's father hadn't even come to see the baby. "Do you think they'd even accept him if we kept him?" Jared's voice softened. "Do you think my family would ever see him as their grandson?" Nia's heart ached. She knew the answer. "They won't," she whispered. Jared nodded, rubbing a hand down his face. "And we can barely survive, Nia. We can't even pay rent this month." She knew he was right about that, too. The apartment was falling apart. Bills piled up faster than they could pay them. She hadn't even been able to afford prenatal care properly. She thought about the people who had money, the ones who could give Malachi everything she never could. Would he grow up happier, safer, in a home where people didn't have to fight for every meal? The thought both comforted and destroyed her. Jared knelt beside her, his voice softer now. "There are families out there who are waiting for a baby like him. Who can give him everything we can't." Nia shut her eyes. "But they won't be us." Jared reached out, touching her knee. Maybe that's a good thing." She hated that part of her agreed with him. The last few hours. They had decided. The orphanage on the outskirts of town was their only option. Nia didn't sleep that night. She spent every second memorizing Malachi's features, his soft, dark curls, the way his tiny chest rose and fell in his sleep. She counted his breaths, traced his chubby fingers. Her heart whispered, "Don't do this." But her mind screamed, "You have no choice." At sunrise, she dressed him in his warmest onesie, wrapping him gently in the softest blanket they owned. He blinked up at her with wide, curious eyes, his tiny mouth forming an "oh," as if sensing something was different. Jared hovered by the door, keys in his shaking hands. "We should go before we change our minds," he said. She already had. But she stood anyway. She pressed Malachi to her chest one last time, inhaling his scent. "I love you," she whispered. "I hope you never hate me for this." Then they walked out the door, stepping into a world that felt colder than ever before. The drive to the unknown. The drive was silent except for the hum of the engine. Jared gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Nia sat in the back seat with Malachi, rocking him gently. Every mile felt like a countdown to heartbreak. She wanted to tell Jared to turn around, to go home, that they would figure it out somehow. But her lips refused to form the words. Instead, she stared out the window, watching the city blur past. Buildings turned into open fields. Sidewalks became winding roads. Then, in the distance, the orphanage appeared. A large, old brick building stood against the dull morning sky, surrounded by iron gates that looked like they belonged in another century. A few children played outside, their laughter ringing out against the silence of her breaking heart. Jared parked the car, but neither of them moved. "This is it," he said, gripping the steering wheel. Nia looked down at Malachi, his tiny hand grasping at her shirt. "Are we really doing this?" she whispered. Jared exhaled slowly. "We don't have a choice." A final goodbye. A nun in a gray habit greeted them at the entrance. She was older, her face kind but lined with years of sorrow. She took one look at them and understood. "You're here to surrender the child?" she asked softly. The word surrender sent a sharp pain through Nia's chest. Jared answered for both of them. "Yes." The nun nodded, motioning them inside. The air inside smelled of old wood and warm porridge. Laughter echoed down the hallways, a cruel reminder that life would go on without them. They were led to a small office. Papers were set on a desk. Jared took the pen, his hands shaking slightly as he filled out Malachi's name. Nia couldn't move. The nun turned to her. "Would you like to say goodbye?" Her throat tightened. She cradled Malachi, pressing her lips to his forehead, breathing in his scent one last time. She wished she could say something that would make this easier. But there were no words. She placed him in the nun's arms. The moment his warmth left her, she felt hollow. Malachi whimpered, then began to cry. Her body screamed at her to take him back. But she forced herself to turn away. Jared placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the door. Step by step, they walked away from their son. The sound of Malachi's cries followed them out. Nia knew then that she would hear that sound in her dreams for the rest of her life. They got into the car. Jared started the engine. Neither of them spoke. As they drove away, Nia glanced into the rearview mirror. The orphanage faded into the distance. And so did a piece of her soul. The boy they left behind. The empty crib. The silence in the apartment was deafening. For the first time in months, there were no soft cries in the middle of the night, no tiny feet kicking against the crib, no small coos filling the air. Just stillness. Nia sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty crib against the wall. She had planned to take it down, to push it into the corner of the apartment where she wouldn't have to see it. But she couldn't. Her arms ached as if her body still expected to hold Malachi, still felt the weight of him pressing against her chest. She pressed her fingers into her palms, as if trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth he had left behind. Jared stood by the door, keys in hand, dressed for work. He hadn't said much since they returned from the orphanage. He moved like a ghost in the apartment, avoiding her eyes, avoiding the conversation they both knew they weren't ready to have. "I have to go," he muttered. She didn't answer. Jared hesitated, then sighed. "Nia, you need to get out of the apartment." Still, she said nothing. With another sigh, he left, shutting the door behind him. She didn't move for hours. When the sun set, she finally stood and walked over to the crib. She traced her fingers over the wooden frame, her breath shaky. She reached inside, picking up the small stuffed rabbit that had been Malachi's favorite. She pressed it to her face, inhaling deeply. His scent was still there. And for the first time since they left him behind, she broke. Sobs tore from her throat as she clutched the tiny toy against her chest. She sank onto the floor, curling into herself, gasping between cries. She had done the right thing. So why did it feel like she had died? A world without them. Malachi was too young to understand what had happened. When he woke up in the unfamiliar crib, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, he cried. A soft voice shushed him gently. Warm hands lifted him from the crib, rocking him back and forth. But it wasn't his mother's arms. It wasn't the warmth he knew. He cried louder. The orphanage was a cold place, despite the kind nuns who ran it. There were too many children, too few hands. Some children stayed for months. Others for years. Some never left at all. Malachi was only a baby, too small to know the difference. But even at such a young age, something inside him knew, he had been left behind. Days passed. Then weeks. Other babies were picked up by smiling couples. They were wrapped in warm coats and taken home. But Malachi remained. People came to look at him. Some smiled. Some hesitated. Some whispered words he would only understand later in life. He's a little dark. Maybe if he were mixed. I don't know, maybe we should wait for another child. And so he waited. But no one came for him. A mother's regret. Nia tried to return to normal. She told herself that she would feel better eventually. That the ache in her chest would fade. But it didn't. It grew worse. She couldn't sleep without hearing Malachi's cries in her head. She couldn't walk past his empty crib without her stomach twisting. She found herself reaching for him at night, only to wake up to cold sheets and silence. And Jared. Jared was different now. He worked longer hours, barely spoke when he was home. He no longer held her at night. Guilt had built a wall between them, one neither of them knew how to break. One night, Nia sat at the kitchen table, staring at the clock on the wall. She had memorized the schedule of the orphanage. She knew when the children ate. When they played. And she knew that right now, Malachi was sleeping in a crib that wasn't his, waiting for a mother who wasn't coming back. The thought made her stomach turn. She pushed back from the table abruptly. She couldn't do this anymore. She needed to see him. A face from the past. The orphanage was quieter at night. Only a few dim lights flickered through the windows, and the air smelled of rain. Nia stood outside the iron gates, gripping them tightly. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had no plan. No excuse for why she was here. She just needed to see him. Summoning what little courage she had, she pushed the gate open and walked toward the front entrance. Before she could knock, the door creaked open. A woman in a gray habit stepped out, her expression unreadable. "I knew you'd come," the nun said softly. Nia froze. "How?" she whispered. The nun gave a sad smile. "Mothers always do." Nia felt a lump rise in her throat. "Is he?" The nun nodded. "He's asleep. Would you like to see him?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Please." She followed the nun inside, her breath shaky. The hallway smelled of old wood and warm milk. A few cribs lined the far wall, soft breathing filling the room. And then, there he was. Malachi. His small body curled under a thin blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily. Nia pressed a hand to her mouth, her knees going weak. He was so beautiful. The nun touched her shoulder. "You can hold him if you'd like." Nia hesitated, afraid that touching him would break her completely. But her arms ached to hold him. Slowly, she reached down, slipping her hands beneath his tiny body. The moment she lifted him, a sob escaped her lips. He was warm. He smelled like baby powder and something uniquely him. His little face scrunched up as he shifted, as if recognizing the familiar scent of his mother. His tiny hand curled into the fabric of her sweater. And Nia knew. She had made a mistake. She had to get him back. No matter what it took. A mother's redemption. A heart torn in two. Nia held Malachi against her chest, inhaling his scent as though it would be enough to fill the gaping hole in her heart. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, his warm breath soft against her skin. She had almost forgotten how small he was. How fragile. Tears welled in her eyes. What had she done? She had convinced herself that she was giving him a better life. That she had been selfless. That a loving family would come and take him away to a home full of warmth and opportunity. But here he was, alone in an orphanage, waiting. Waiting for someone who might never come. The nun stood quietly behind her, watching with a knowing expression. "You regret it," she murmured. Nia swallowed hard. Every second of every day. The words came out choked, raw. She clutched Malachi tighter, her fingers trembling. "Can I take him back?" she whispered, afraid of the answer. The nun sighed. "It's not that simple." Nia's stomach dropped. "Why?" she asked, her voice urgent. "The moment you signed the papers, he legally became a ward of the state," the nun explained. "His file is already being processed for potential adoption. The law doesn't make it easy for parents who surrender their rights to reclaim their child." Nia's breath hitched. "But I didn't, I wasn't thinking straight." The nun reached out, squeezing her shoulder gently. "I believe you, child. But the law does not consider regret a legal reason to undo what's been done." Panic gripped Nia's chest. Her son wasn't hers anymore. The thought sent her world crumbling. Tears spilled onto Malachi's blanket. She couldn't leave him. Not again. There had to be a way. "I'll fight for him," she said desperately, looking up at the nun. "I'll do whatever it takes." The nun's kind eyes filled with sympathy. "Then you need a lawyer." The battle for her son. Nia didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Jared's even breathing beside her. The weight of what she had done sat heavy on her chest, suffocating her. Jared hadn't noticed she was gone. Or maybe he had but chose not to ask. They were both drowning in their own silence. When morning came, she made a decision. She wasn't going to lose Malachi without a fight. A plea for help. The lawyer's office was smaller than she expected, cluttered with stacks of paper and framed degrees on the wall. The woman behind the desk, Ms. Carmichael, was older, with streaks of silver in her dark hair. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the paperwork Nia had brought. Nia sat on the edge of the chair, gripping her hands together. Finally, Ms. Carmichael set the papers down and looked at her. "This is going to be an uphill battle," she said. Nia's heart pounded. "But there's a chance?" The lawyer hesitated. "There's always a chance. But reclaiming parental rights after voluntary surrender is one of the hardest cases to win." Nia bit her lip, her nails digging into her palms. "I don't care how hard it is. I have to try." Ms. Carmichael leaned forward. "Tell me, Nia. What made you change your mind?" Nia swallowed back the lump in her throat. "I was scared. We were struggling. I thought letting him go would give him a better life. But I was wrong. He's still waiting. He doesn't have a family. He has no one." Her voice cracked. "I need to fix this." The lawyer studied her carefully before nodding. "Then we'll start with filing a petition to revoke your voluntary termination. But I need you to understand something." She leaned forward. "The court won't care about your feelings, Nia. They'll want proof that you can provide for Malachi now in a way you couldn't before. They'll want to know why they should trust that you won't abandon him again." Nia's stomach twisted. "I won't," she whispered. Ms. Carmichael gave a small nod. "Then be ready to prove it." A fractured home. Nia stepped into the apartment, her mind still spinning from everything the lawyer had told her. The moment she closed the door, Jared's voice cut through the air. "Where were you?" She turned to see him standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Her heart pounded. She hadn't told him. She hadn't told him that she had seen Malachi. That she had held him. That she was going to fight to get him back. She swallowed hard. "I went to see a lawyer." Jared's brow furrowed. "A lawyer? Why?" She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, "I want Malachi back." Silence. Jared's jaw tightened. His face paled. "Nia," he said slowly. "We talked about this." She shook her head. "No. We didn't. We made a decision out of fear, and it was wrong." Jared exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "This isn't just about what we want. There are legal consequences, Nia. Do you even know if we can get him back?" "I'll do whatever it takes," she said fiercely. Jared stared at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you?" His voice was low, frustrated. "We're barely making it as it is. We're drowning. Bringing Malachi back won't change that." Nia's chest tightened. "He's our son." Jared sighed heavily. "And maybe he'd be better off without us." The words felt like a slap. She took a step back, as if physically recoiling from him. "How can you say that?" Jared's shoulders slumped. "Because I'm being realistic." "No," she snapped. "You're being a coward." His eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" "You gave up on him the moment he was born," she accused, her voice rising. "You let the world tell you that he wasn't good enough. That we weren't good enough to be his parents. And instead of proving them wrong, you ran." Jared clenched his jaw, looking away. "And what happens if we get him back and we fail again, Nia? What if we can't give him what he needs? What if we just end up hurting him more?" Tears burned in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that walking away again isn't an option." Jared stared at her, his expression torn. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You really want to do this?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then I guess we fight." Relief flooded her, but she knew this was only the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. And she wouldn't stop until Malachi was back where he belonged. The battle for Malachi. The storm before the fight. The apartment felt smaller than ever, its walls pressing in on them like a suffocating cage. The weight of their decision, the fight ahead, sat heavy between Nia and Jared. They had spent the night in silence after their argument, but the tension never faded. Jared paced the room, rubbing his hands down his face. "So, what now?" he muttered. "We just throw everything we have into this and hope the courts agree?" Nia, seated at the kitchen table, stared at the scattered papers Ms. Carmichael had given her the day before. They detailed everything they needed: financial proof, employment stability, character witnesses, proof of living conditions. It wasn't enough to just want Malachi back. They had to prove they deserved him. "We do what we have to," Nia said, gripping the papers. "We have to show them that we're capable parents now. That we made a mistake, but we won't make another one." Jared scoffed. "You make it sound easy." "It's not. But it's worth it." He exhaled sharply. "And if we lose?" She met his eyes, her voice firm. "Then at least we'll know we tried." Jared was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sat across from her, running a hand through his hair. "All right. Tell me what we need to do." For the first time in months, Nia felt a flicker of hope. The roadblocks begin. The first step was proving financial stability. Nia had been working part-time at a small diner, barely making ends meet. Jared's construction job paid better, but it wasn't enough to paint them as financially fit parents. They needed a stable income that wouldn't make the courts question their ability to provide. So, Nia went job hunting. She walked into every store, every restaurant, every office, handing in applications, hoping someone would take a chance on her. Days passed. Rejections piled up. Her lack of college education worked against her. Some places wouldn't even look at her twice. Until she found Ms. Elaine's daycare center. It was a small, independently owned daycare, tucked between an old bookstore and a laundromat. The moment Nia stepped inside, she felt something shift inside her. This was where she belonged. The owner, Ms. Elaine, was a warm-faced woman in her 60s, with gentle eyes and a voice that carried wisdom. "You're good with kids?" Ms. Elaine asked, looking over her resume. "Yes," Nia said quickly. I used to babysit when I was younger." "And she hesitated. "I have a son." Ms. Elaine glanced up. "Have?" Nia swallowed. "I'm fighting to get him back." Something flickered in the woman's eyes, understanding. She leaned back in her chair. "You're determined." "I have to be," Nia admitted. A slow smile spread across Ms. Elaine's face. "Then you start Monday." Relief crashed over Nia like a wave. One step closer. The fractured bonds. While Nia worked on rebuilding her life, Jared was battling his own demons. His father had never approved of his relationship with Nia. And when Malachi was born, the man had cut off all ties. But Jared knew that the courts would look at family support. And despite everything, he needed to try. So he found himself standing outside his parents' house for the first time in nearly a year. The door opened. His mother stood there, eyes widening in shock. "Jared?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Hey, Ma." She hesitated before stepping aside. "Come in." The house smelled the same, spiced candles and the faint scent of his father's aftershave. But the air felt different. Colder. His father sat in his recliner, flipping through a newspaper. He barely looked up. "So, you finally remembered where we live?" Jared clenched his jaw. "I came because I need to talk." His father turned the page of his paper. "Didn't seem like you needed to talk when you threw your life away." Jared exhaled, trying to stay calm. "I'm fighting to get my son back." That got his father's attention. He slowly lowered the paper, raising an eyebrow. "Son?" Jared swallowed. "Malachi." His father's expression hardened. "You gave that child away." Jared's hands curled into fists. "And I regret it." His father scoffed. "Regret doesn't undo choices, boy." Jared's mother placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "James." But James shook his head. "I told you from the start, Jared." "That woman." "Don't," Jared warned. James held his gaze. "She ruined you." Anger flared in Jared's chest. "No," he said firmly. "I ruined myself. I let other people's opinions make me weak. But I'm done making excuses." He took a deep breath. "I came here because the court will ask if we have family support. If we have a strong foundation to raise Malachi." He met his father's cold gaze. "And I wanted to know if you'd stand with us." Silence. Then. "No." Jared's stomach dropped. James stood, placing the newspaper on the table. "You made your choice, Jared. Now live with it." Jared clenched his jaw, his heart pounding. Fine. He turned to his mother, his voice softer. Mom? Tears filled her eyes, but she hesitated. And that was his answer. Jared took a step back, his chest tight. Goodbye. Then he walked out, slamming the door behind him. And for the first time in his life, he realized he didn't need their approval anymore. The court summons. Weeks passed. Nia worked every shift she could. Jared picked up extra hours. They moved into a slightly better apartment, one with an actual bedroom for Malachi. They met with social workers, gathered character witnesses, and prepared for the hardest fight of their lives. Then, one evening, an envelope arrived in the mail. Nia's hands trembled as she opened it. Her breath caught. It was the court date. Everything would be decided in 1 month. She met Jared's eyes. This is it, she whispered. He nodded. We're ready. But were they? Because the fight was just beginning. And they had no idea what awaited them in that courtroom, fighting for Malachi. The weight of the courtroom. The courthouse smelled of old paper and polished wood, a place where lives were decided with the stroke of a judge's pen. The air was thick with tension, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface. Nia sat stiffly in her chair, hands clenched in her lap. Jared sat beside her, shoulders tight, eyes fixed ahead. Ms. Carmichael, their lawyer, adjusted her glasses and glanced between them. Stay calm, she whispered. We have a strong case, but the judge will be looking for consistency. Confidence. Any sign of doubt will work against us. Nia nodded, but inside, she was anything but calm. This was it. This was the moment that would decide if she would hold her son in her arms again, or walk out of here empty-handed. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. The doors at the front of the courtroom opened. The judge entered, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. She settled into her seat, scanning the papers in front of her. This is the case of Nia Dawson and Jared Mitchell, petitioning for reinstatement of parental rights for the minor child, Malachi Dawson, she announced. Nia's heart pounded. The judge turned her gaze to them. Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Dawson, I have reviewed the preliminary filings. I want to be clear, this is not a simple case of regret. The law does not take parental surrender lightly. Nia swallowed hard. We understand, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then let's proceed. The opposing attorney, a sharp-faced woman in a navy suit, stood. Your Honor, the state contends that the petitioners willingly relinquished their rights and have provided insufficient evidence that reinstating those rights would be in the best interest of the child. Jared stiffened beside Nia. Ms. Carmichael stood. Your Honor, my clients acknowledge their past decision, but they have worked tirelessly to correct their mistake. They are financially stable, have a home prepared for their child, and have demonstrated their commitment to providing a safe and loving environment. The judge held up a hand. I will hear both sides. She turned to Nia. Ms. Dawson, tell me, why should I believe that you won't abandon your child again? Nia's breath caught. She gripped the table edge, her knuckles white. This was it. She looked the judge in the eye. Because I have spent every day since I let him go regretting it. The courtroom was silent. Nia took a shaky breath. I was afraid. Afraid that I wasn't enough. That we weren't enough. I thought giving Malachi away would protect him from a life of struggle. But all I did was leave him alone in a system that doesn't love him the way I do. Her voice broke, but she pressed on. I have spent every second working to become the mother he deserves. I have a stable job. A home. And more than anything, I have the unwavering determination to be in my son's life. She swallowed hard. I failed him once. I won't fail him again. The judge studied her carefully. Then, she turned to Jared. "Mr. Mitchell, do you feel the same?" Jared sat up straighter, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor." He hesitated, then said, "I was weak. I let other people's opinions dictate how I saw my own son. And I hate myself for that. But I'm done running. I will stand by Malachi no matter what." The judge nodded, then turned to the opposing attorney. "Do you have any direct evidence that contradicts their ability to provide a stable home?" The woman pursed her lips. "We do not, but we would argue that the emotional damage caused by their initial abandonment could negatively impact the child's well-being." Ms. Carmichael stood. "Your Honor, children in the foster system face far greater emotional distress than reunification with biological parents who are committed to their well-being. If Malachi had been adopted already, this would be a different discussion. But he hasn't been." The judge tapped her pen against the desk. A long silence followed. Then, she spoke. "I will take this case under advisement. My ruling will be delivered in 48 hours. She stood. Court was adjourned. A painful wait. The next 2 days crawled by in agonizing slow motion. Nia barely slept. Jared buried himself in work. Neither of them knew what to expect. Every possible outcome played in Nia's mind. What if they lost? What if Malachi was placed with another family before they could appeal? The thought made her physically ill. Then, the call came. Ms. Carmichael's voice was calm but firm. "The judge has made her decision. We need to be in court at 9 a.m. tomorrow." Nia's breath caught. "Do we have a chance?" There was a pause. "Be there," was all the lawyer said. The final verdict. The courtroom felt even colder the next morning. Nia and Jared sat hand in hand, barely breathing as the judge entered. She settled into her chair, adjusting her glasses. "I have reviewed this case thoroughly," she began, her voice even. "The decision to relinquish parental rights is not one the court takes lightly. However, neither is the decision to reinstate them." Nia's fingers tightened around Jared's. The judge glanced at her papers, then back at them. "Based on the evidence presented, I find that the petitioners have made substantial efforts to correct their previous decision. They have demonstrated financial stability, personal growth, and an unwavering commitment to their child." The air was so thick Nia could barely breathe. Then. "The court rules in favor of the petitioners." For a moment, the words didn't register. Then. A sob broke from Nia's throat. She clutched Jared's arm, barely able to process the flood of emotions crashing over her. Ms. Carmichael smiled. "You're getting your son back." Nia let out a shaky breath. When can we see him?" The judge's expression softened. "Immediately. Home at last." The orphanage looked different this time. Brighter. Or maybe it was just Nia's heart that had changed. She and Jared walked through the halls, their hands shaking. Then. There he was. Malachi sat on the floor, a stuffed rabbit in his hands. He looked up at them, his big brown eyes full of curiosity. Nia dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Hi, baby," she whispered. Malachi blinked. Then, as if some part of him remembered her, his tiny face broke into a smile. "Ma." Nia sobbed as she scooped him into her arms, holding him against her chest. "I'm here, baby," she choked out. "I'm here." Jared knelt beside them, pressing a trembling kiss to Malachi's forehead. They had done it. They had fought for him. And now, finally. He was home. The journey home. A new beginning. Malachi's tiny arms wrapped tightly around Nia's neck as if he was afraid she might disappear again. His warmth, his scent, the soft rise and fall of his breath, it was real. He was really hers again. Jared stood beside them, his hand resting on Malachi's back. His eyes were glassy, his lips pressed into a trembling smile. They had fought, they had struggled, and now, they were standing in the orphanage's hallway, ready to take their son home. The head nun, Sister Agnes, stood nearby, watching the reunion with a gentle expression. "He's been waiting for this, you know." Nia looked up, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting too." Sister Agnes nodded. "He had a hard time sleeping at first. Some nights, he would cry for hours. But I think, deep down, he always believed you'd come back." Nia's throat tightened. She kissed the top of Malachi's head. "I should have never left." The nun offered her a kind smile. "Sometimes, the hardest lessons bring the greatest strength." She placed a gentle hand on Malachi's back. "You're his world. Make sure he never has to question that again." Nia and Jared exchanged a look. They wouldn't fail him again. Not ever. With that, they signed the final release papers and stepped outside for the first time as a reunited family. The ride home. The drive home was eerily silent at first. Malachi sat in the back seat, strapped into a borrowed car seat, staring out the window with wide eyes. His tiny fingers gripped the stuffed rabbit Sister Agnes had given him, holding it tightly against his chest. Nia glanced at him through the rearview mirror, watching the way his gaze flickered between the passing buildings. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. He was watching. Observing. As if he was trying to piece together where he was going. Jared reached over and placed a hand on Nia's knee, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're home, baby," Nia whispered, though she wasn't sure if Malachi understood. But then, slowly, he turned his head toward her voice. And he smiled. Adjusting to a new life. The apartment felt different with Malachi in it. Nia had spent days preparing his room, setting up a crib, gathering clothes and toys. It wasn't much, it wasn't a big, luxurious home like other kids might have, but it was filled with love. She carried Malachi inside, setting him down in the living room. He stood there, hesitant, looking around as if trying to decide whether this place belonged to him. Jared knelt beside him, holding out a small toy truck. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "This is yours." Malachi looked up at him. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, cautiously, he took the truck. And just like that, something shifted. The walls that had been built between them, the unspoken fear that Malachi might not remember them, might not love them anymore. They crumbled. He sat down on the floor and pushed the truck forward, watching it roll across the carpet. Then he giggled, a small, soft sound that sent warmth flooding through Nia's chest. She dropped onto her knees beside them, wrapping her arms around Malachi and Jared. It was happening. They were a family again. And this time, nothing would take that away from them. The first night back together. Nightfall came quickly. Nia stood in the doorway of Malachi's new room, watching as he lay curled in his crib. He had fallen asleep clutching his stuffed rabbit, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Jared leaned against the doorframe beside her. "Think he'll sleep through the night?" Nia let out a soft laugh. "I don't know. But if he doesn't, I won't mind." Jared's arm wrapped around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We really did it," he murmured. She nodded, pressing her head against his shoulder. "Yeah. We did." A part of her had worried that Malachi wouldn't feel safe with them. That he'd cry, that he wouldn't trust them. But when she had tucked him into his crib, he had grabbed her hand and held it against his chest until he drifted off to sleep. That small act had told her everything. He still loved her. Despite everything, despite the pain, despite the mistakes. He had never stopped waiting for her. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from hope. From love. From the realization that this was their second chance. And this time, they would get it right. A love that couldn't be broken. Days turned into weeks. Malachi adjusted to his new home little by little. At first, he would hesitate before reaching for Nia or Jared, as if afraid they might disappear again. But over time, that fear faded. He started to crawl into their laps during story time. He giggled when Jared tossed him in the air. He reached for Nia's hand whenever they walked outside. One evening, as Nia was tucking him into bed, Malachi looked up at her with sleepy eyes and whispered the word that shattered her heart in the best way possible. "Mama." A sob caught in her throat. She cupped his tiny face, kissing his forehead. "I love you, baby." And for the first time since she had let him go, she truly believed. Everything was going to be okay. Epilogue, a future built on love. Years passed. Malachi grew into a bright, joyful child. His laughter filled their home. His tiny hands clung to Nia's whenever they crossed the street. He followed Jared around the apartment, mimicking his every move. They took him to the park, to the zoo, to the beach for the first time. They celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and random Tuesday nights with movie marathons and homemade cookies. They built a life. A family. One day, when Malachi was 6, he sat beside Nia on the couch, looking through an old photo album. He pointed to a picture of the orphanage. "Mama," he asked, "why did I live there?" Nia's breath caught. She looked into his innocent eyes, wondering how much of the truth he was ready for. Then she took his small hands in hers. "Because Mommy and Daddy made a mistake," she said softly. "But we fought to bring you home." Malachi tilted his head. "Did you win?" Nia smiled, kissing his forehead. "We did, baby," she whispered. "And we'll keep winning, every day, as long as we have you." Malachi grinned, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you, Mama." Tears burned Nia's eyes. "I love you more, baby." Jared walked into the room, ruffling Malachi's hair. "What's all this?" Malachi turned and threw his arms around Jared's neck. "Just talking about how Mommy and Daddy won me back." Jared chuckled, pulling them both into a hug. And in that moment, as they sat together in the warmth of their home, Nia knew. This was the family they had fought for. This was the love they had almost lost. But love, real love, never truly fades. And they would spend the rest of their lives proving that to their son.